Hello Year 9 and 10, this is lesson 2 of the Prelude. So if you haven't done part 1, lesson on part 1, go back and do that before you do this lesson. So to start off with for a do now, could you please have a look at the image on the screen there? A mountain and a lake. What I would like you to do is first of all identify 3 nouns in the image. So nouns are your things, so it could be the mountain, the water, the clouds, whatever you want. And then the second task is to write a sentence describing each noun using personification. Okay, so personification, when we give inanimate objects human characteristics, make them sound as though they are alive. For a challenge there, once you've done that, you can try to write a paragraph describing a lonely mountain on a lake, trying to use at least 2 examples of personification. Okay, so pause the video now and have a go at the do now. Okay, hopefully we've done that, and just get ourselves a bit creative, thinking about how we use personification. So what we're going to look at today, the what, how and why is the same as last lesson, so we're continuing on with the prelude. What we're going to do is finish analysing the poem, so we're going to read the second half of that poem in today's lesson and answer some questions on it. We're also going to think about the structure and form of the poem, how that adds to the meaning. That is a key skill that you will need to be able to comment on to get the highest marks in your GCSE, and we're going to be thinking about those main devices that Wordsworth uses. So moving on, a quick recap from the last lesson, make sure you were paying attention. So I've got 4 questions here. I want you to just pause the video, have a look at the questions, write down your answers, and then come back and we will go through the answers. Okay, so question number 1, what did the Romantic poets believe about nature? They believed in the beauty of nature, also the power of nature, so they were very anti-industrialisation, thought there was a lot of beauty in the natural world and in rural settings. Second one, what is the concept of the sublime? So we went through this a little bit in the context of the last lesson. We're going to come back to this a lot today when we're looking at the poem. So this was the idea that nature can elicit a sort of fear and admiration, and it's like a sublime experience to experience nature in that way, okay, where it's wholly sort of terrifying or really admirable. Number 3, what happened in the first half of the poem? So the first half of the poem that we read last time, hopefully you remember, we had our narrator steal a boat and go out rowing on the lake. There was a sense of peacefulness, it was a very idyllic setting, and we also had this idea that the poet was very confident, quite arrogant in his sort of power over nature at that point in the poem. And the last question kind of ties in with question number 3. What tone was created in the first half of the poem? We had a tone of sort of confidence, a tone of peacefulness. It was very calm and very peaceful. Okay, so hopefully we remember all of that from last lesson, and now we are ready to start looking at the second half of the poem. So before we continue reading the poem, few key words. So I'll go through a few keywords that come up in the poem that you might not know, give you the definitions. If you don't know the word, write it down so that you can remember what it means and the definition. So the first word is grim. You might have heard this before. Sort of if something's very grim, it might be unfriendly or sort of unattractive. In this poem, when the poet uses the word grim, he sort of means unfriendly, quite hostile person. Covert is when something is secret or hidden. Solitude means sort of loneliness. and volta. Now this is a poetic term I wanted to put on here as it is a really key word that we need to know for today's lesson. So a volta is a change in tone or a sort of turning point in a poem. Okay, so where we're going to start off with our poem today, that is the volta, the change in tone, the turning point of this poem. So any of those words you don't know, could you write them down please? As a challenge, you could try to use them in a sentence, so take a minute to do that. Okay, continuing with our poem then. So we got to the point, the last line that we read, which was line 20, was the poet, the narrator, he went heaving through the water like a swan. So he's rowing, very confident, quite arrogant. Okay, and then we get to this point. So this is the turning point of the poem. So I'm just going to read through the section there, and then I will put up some questions, same as the first half of the poem, that you can answer, and then we'll go back through the questions. So it carries on. When, from behind that craggy steep till then, the horizon's bound a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head, I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. Okay, so here's the questions. Just pause the video for about 5 minutes, answer the questions, try and put in as much detail as you can into your answers, especially where it asks what the effect is. Okay, really try and think why those words or those devices have been used. Okay, and try and write in as much detail as possible. So pause now and then come back and we will go through the answers. Okay, so for question 1, we've got line 21 is the volta, the turning point of the poem. How does the tone change? So here the tone becomes a lot more sinister and dark and sort of threatening. So beforehand we had all this imagery of nature being quite beautiful with words like glittering, sparkling, light, it was like a swan. Okay, some really beautiful imagery of nature, and that all changes now. Okay, and the imagery becomes a lot darker, a lot more threatening. So it changes there when from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound a huge peak, black and huge. So what happens here is the poet, he sees the mountain that he was sort of rowing towards, but it almost comes up closer than he was expecting. It takes him by surprise, it frightens him, and that changes the whole tone of the poem and his sort of outlook on nature as well. Question number 2 was in line 22, what device is used and what is the effect? So this is where he says the horizon's bound, so on the horizon where he can see a huge peak, black and huge. Okay, what we've got there is we've got repetition of that word huge and quite simplistic language. Okay, huge peak, black and huge. They're very simple words. We know that Wordsworth has got much better vocabulary than that. It's evidenced through the rest of the poem. So the question is, why does he repeat such a simple word there in that same line? And it could be because he's almost left speechless by what he can see. He's so almost gobsmacked, he can't form the words to describe what he's seeing. He can't form a coherent thought, so he just ends up repeating that quite simple word of huge, okay, because he's so maybe shocked or taken aback by this mountain that he can see. Question 3, in lines 23 and 24, what device is used and what is the effect? So line 23 and 24, we've got as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. So what we've got there is some personification of the mountain. So it's that idea that with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. So it's like he can see the mountain moving and almost being quite threatening, as if it's going to attack him, which is a huge contrast to how he was describing nature earlier on in the poem. And now it's become threatening and like it's going to attack. We've got question 4. How does the narrator feel at this part of the poem? Okay, so we can see that he feels quite scared and terrified, okay, and almost in a panic. So on line 24 there, he says, I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. So he struck and struck again. It's like he's trying to get away. He's in a panic. He's trying to row quite fast, which contrasts again to how he was rowing earlier. And it says, with trembling oars I turned, on line 29. So again, that verb trembling to describe himself, it shows us that he's got this sense of fear and he's terrified, which we can link that to that idea of the sublime, how the romantic poets felt that nature could be so overpowering and terrifying, and to experience that was quite sublime, and that's what he's experiencing here, this really sort of life-changing experience where he sees, you know, how intimidating nature can be. Then line 5, we've got from lines 25 to 30, there is a repeated S sound. What device is this and what is the effect? So if we have a look, lines 25 to 30, quite a lot of it. I'll just pick out a few key phrases. So we've got, it grew still in stature, towered up between me and the stars, still for so it seemed. We've got, it strode after me, and he turned back through the silent water, stole my way. So a lot of S sounds in there. Okay, when the S sound is repeated like that through a phrase, it's called sibilance. Okay, so that sibilance, it helps to create quite a sinister tone, okay, which contrasts to the peacefulness of before. Remember, in that first section that I showed you from the last lesson, there was a repeated L sound, which made it sound quite gentle and peaceful. Now it's different, okay? That sibilance is making it sound very sinister. Okay, let's have a look at the next bit. Again with this, if you had different answers, you could still be right. Of course, I've just given you sort of my interpretation, but there are different interpretations. There might be different things that you have picked out from the poem. That's absolutely fine. Okay. This is the last section of the poem. So he sort of rode away from this mountain that he has been scared by, and it says, there in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. Okay. So only 3 questions on this part, so try to add quite a bit of detail to your answers. Reread it, really think about what the message is, what is the poet trying to say in this last bit. Okay, so pause now and answer those questions, and then come back and we'll go through the answers. Okay, so question number 1. How does the narrator feel at returning home? We could say the narrator feels quite uneasy. This fear kind of stays with him, how he felt when he became scared of that mountain, of how intimidating, how big it was. Okay, so he's scared. he feels uneasy. He's almost changed by the experience. And this is one of the main points of the poem, is how some experiences can change you as a person. Okay, and this experience really did change him and how he felt. He also probably feels a bit humbled. Okay, at the beginning of the poem, he was quite arrogant in his skill. He thought he had some sort of power over nature. He appreciated the beauty of it, but perhaps didn't respect it as he was going out on that lake with the stolen boat. Whereas now he almost feels, like I said, a bit humbled in that he's not as powerful as nature. He should respect it. Okay, so number 2, it sort of links in with this. How has the narrator's view of nature changed? So what happens is the narrator now understands that nature has this power over man, and that nature and those mountains, they can be very intimidating and terrifying, and man is so small and insignificant in comparison. Okay, so the idea that nature can have power over man, and that we should, as man, we should respect nature. And number 3, what is the poet's message about the power of nature? So the key message here is all about how we should respect nature, how nature can be sublime, so it can be beautiful and incredible, but it can also be terrifying and intimidating. So man should respect nature and not try to think that they're better than nature, perhaps, as he did at the beginning of the poem, and then he learned his lesson that he had probably been too arrogant. So it's that sense that we need to respect nature, and that sometimes, you know, nature can have power over man. We shouldn't underestimate it. Okay. We can see, just looking at a couple other bits in that section as well, you know, he can't remember nature as he did before. There's no familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. So it's like his whole view on life has changed as a result of this experience. Okay? And that's a really key feature of romantic poetry, is to write about things that really change a person, to write about this sort of epic journey. Okay, and that's really what Wordsworth did. Okay, we are going to move on, having looked at all the poem, going to move on and have a think about the structure and the sort of form of this poem. There's 3 main sections in the extract, because it's an extract of the poem. So the first section, okay, the tone is very light and carefree, with that rural scene, and the poet employs the pretty pastoral imagery. So that's that whole beginning section that we looked at in lesson 1 of this poem. The second section, there's a volta. Okay, so the change in mood, and the tone becomes darker, more fearful and threatening. And then the final section, the narrator, he reflects on how this experience has changed him. Okay, so that's the key structure of our poem, and it really reads quite a lot like a story. Okay, so there's like a beginning, middle and end of this story, which is different from some of the other poetry that you will look at. So having a look at what we call all of that, can we, as I go through this for the form and structure, can you make sure you just make some notes down on the key points? In your exam, if you're able to comment on the structure of a poem, you will get in a higher band, in a higher mark, than if you're only commenting on the language. Okay, so some of these key points that I'm going to talk through are really important if we want to think about hitting those higher marks, okay, when we're writing about poetry. So what this poem is an autobiographical first-person narrative. Okay, so it's written in the first person. We know that the narrator is experiencing this, and what it does is it gives it a personal feel, and it gives the reader an insight into the thoughts of the speaker. Okay? And that's a key feature of romantic poetry, to really explore emotions and inner thoughts. The poem has a regular rhythm, okay, which makes it sound like natural speech. When you're reading the poem, it's almost as if someone is telling a story. It's very natural. And that's achieved through caesura and enjambment. So if you don't remember, a caesura is when there's a pause in the middle of a line of poetry. So if you have a look back at the poem, there are a lot of commas throughout. Okay. And enjambment is when the lines flow into one another, so when there's not a pause at the end of a line. Again, this happens quite a lot throughout the poem, and it just makes it sound like a story, like someone's telling a story, like it's a natural speech. So the poet employs blank verse, which means that it's written in iambic pentameter, meaning there are 10 syllables in each line. Again, that's what makes it sound quite conversational, like speech as well. And traditionally, this form, so blank verse, was used to discuss serious issues. And for Wordsworth, this was a very serious issue. It was an experience that really changed him. It can be viewed as an epic poem, so that's the name of this type of poem. In length, obviously, it is a very long poem, a long piece of writing. We've only read an extract from it. Usually epic poems deal with exciting, action-packed, heroic events, maybe like wars or explorations. A lot of the events that Wordsworth writes about are ordinary. Obviously in this poem he just went out rowing on the lake, but they're given a really epic quality because they had such an impact on his life. Okay, so even though it's not a really heroic journey that he goes on, it was really significant to him in his life, and that's why he writes it like it is an epic poem. Okay, just pause here if you want to just pause this and make a few notes based on those parts, and then we'll move on. Okay, so just continuing, a couple more points on the form and structure. There are no stanzas, okay? When I started showing you the poem, remember I said I'd split it into sections, but they weren't stanzas. The actual poem is just one long continuous stanza, okay? So it's continuous, a lot of punctuation to help us read it naturally, and it's a complete story in itself. Okay. It's also conversational, okay? It's as if he's there telling us the story of what happened to himself. The poet uses a lot of ands throughout, which gives the verse almost a sort of breathless quality. Because when we're telling a story, and I'm probably doing it now when I'm talking through this lesson, is I'm saying a lot of ands all the time. So that's what Wordsworth does in this poem. It gives it more of a personal feel, as if he's really telling us this story himself. Okay, again, just pause if you want to make a few notes on those. And then moving on. So we're going to do another paragraph today. It is a similar question to yesterday, but this time, or from the last lesson, but this time we are going to think a bit more about the whole poem. Okay, so how does Wordsworth present ideas about nature in the Prelude? Have a think. Okay, how does he present nature at the beginning? How does he present nature at the end of the poem? How do they contrast? Yeah, because that's one of the key points of this poem. And think, what's he trying to say about them? Okay, I would like you just to focus on the Prelude today. I would like you to try and do 2 paragraphs again, 2 of those P's paragraphs. But for your challenge, I've got there, can you comment on a structural technique and the effect of this? Okay, so what I would like you to try and challenge yourself to do is, when you get to the zoom in part of your paragraph, I'd like you to do your normal zoom in, okay, where you pick out a word or device, explain the effect. And then I'd like you to see if you can have a go at adding another sentence, another couple of sentences of analysis, but try to analyse a structural feature. Okay, so maybe, you know, it's written in the first person because, and what effect does that have? Or what effect the enjambment or a caesura has. Okay, and see if you can comment on a structural feature, because that is quite important for getting you those higher marks. Okay, so have a look through, spend about 15 to 20 minutes, try and do 2 paragraphs. So pause the video and then come back when you finish that. Okay. When you have finished your paragraphs, please email them to your teacher for some feedback, to see where you could improve and what you have done well. Okay. Last little bit then, we are going to do revision task to finish off. So obviously, going back through all of these poems, you will need to know these poems for your GCSE. So what I'd like you to do as a good revision technique is choose 3 key quotations from the poem. What I suggest is probably 1 quotation from each of the key sections of the poem. Okay, so the beginning where it's all peaceful, the Volta sort of section where it becomes a bit more threatening and he gets scared, and then the final section where he sort of reflects on what it meant for him. So choose a quotation from each of the key sections, and I want you to do a quote explosion on this quotation. So write down your quote sort of in the middle of the page with some room around it, and I want you to really annotate on your quote what devices have been used, the effect of certain words, so what connotations words have, links to context, so how does it link to the Romantic era, how does it link to Wordsworth, and then if there are any structural features that you notice in your quotation. Okay, so you can do these on sort of flashcards, you can do these in your book. Okay, but these are going to be 3 key quotes that I would like you to do a quote explosion for. Okay, so pause the video and you can do that. Okay, when you finish that, we are now finished with this poem. So well done for going through both lessons. Hopefully my voice didn't get too annoying. I do find it quite annoying on the recording, so hopefully you didn't find it too bad. So what you will have on class charts as well is a booklet with a few activities on this poem. Could you go and complete those now and also send those on to your teacher? Okay, and I will speak to you all again soon. Thank you.